The night everything went quiet, I was sitting in my car, engine off, watching my phone glow like it was the last thing keeping me alive. The Uber app pulsed softly in my hand. No requests. Just silence. The kind that presses against your chest until you start wondering if this is what suffocation feels like. 3 months earlier, my ex-wife had taken everything. Not half. Not most. Everything. The Texas ranch we built together, the trucking company I spent 10 years scaling, hers. Even my dog. The last thing that still greeted me like I mattered. Her final text still lived rent-free in my head. You'll never recover from this. She didn't send it in anger. That's what hurt the most. It was calm. Certain. Like a weather forecast. I was 33 years old, parked outside a dimly lit gas station on the edge of Austin, wearing a wrinkled button-down that used to mean something. Once, men shook my hand differently when I wore it. Now it just smelled faintly of stale coffee and regret. I refreshed my bank app again even though I already knew the number. $217. That was it. That was the sum total of a life I thought was bulletproof. I'd built my identity on motion, growth charts, expansion plans, acreage, horsepower. Forward was the only direction I knew how to move. Until the divorce slammed everything into reverse so fast I got whiplash. The settlement wasn't even a fight. That's the part nobody understands. People assume I lost because I hired the wrong lawyer. Or because she outmaneuvered me. Or because Texas courts favor one side. The truth is simpler and uglier. I didn't fight because somewhere deep down, I was tired of defending a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. The app finally chimed. Pickup request. I started the engine, my reflection briefly catching in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at me looked older than 33. Hollowed out. Like someone had scooped out whatever used to make him dangerous. The passenger was a woman in her late 20s, heels in one hand, phone in the other, already apologizing before she got in. Long night, she said. Aren't they all? I replied. She laughed. I didn't. The ride was quiet. The city slid past us in neon streaks, bars, offices, people laughing on sidewalks like the world hadn't just ended. When I dropped her off, she thanked me distractedly and hurried inside a glass tower that screamed money. I didn't realize she'd left her purse behind until I pulled away. I considered it for exactly 3 seconds. Returning it would cost me time. Another fare. But some reflex, something older than survival mode, made me turn around. Her office lobby smelled like polished stone and confidence. The kind of place I used to belong in. The kind of place where people didn't glance twice at a man walking in at midnight because they assumed he had a reason. I approached the desk. Hi, I said. Someone left this in my car. The assistant looked up, bored, ready to say thank you and move on. Then her eyes narrowed. She looked at the purse. Then at me. Then back at me again. Her face changed. Oh my God, she said quietly. I felt my shoulders tense. What? She stood up slowly, like she was afraid I might disappear if she moved too fast. You're James Holloway's son, aren't you? The name hit me like a foreign language. I don't know who that is, I said. Her mouth opened. That was your father, she said. He worked here in 1987. I almost laughed. My father died when I was 12, I said automatically. Different guy. She shook her head, already reaching for her phone. No, she said. He died 3 months ago. Heart attack. We just finished probate. My stomach dropped. She looked at me like she was staring at a ghost. He owned 75% of this company. The room tilted. I gripped the counter, suddenly very aware of how thin the air felt. That's not possible, I said. My dad was a truck driver. He barely stayed in one place long enough to unpack. She swallowed. I don't know what to tell you, she said. But James Holloway built this place after he left. Quietly. He didn't want publicity. Silence filled the space between us, thick and unreal. I drove away 10 minutes later with no purse in my car and a name I'd never heard echoing in my head. James Holloway. I pulled over a few blocks away and shut the engine off. My hands were shaking. All my life, I'd believed my father disappeared because he was weak. Because he couldn't handle responsibility. Because he chose absence over effort. That story had shaped everything. It's why I chased control so hard. Why I built companies instead of relationships. Why I believed stability came from ownership, not presence. And now some stranger was telling me the man I resented had owned most of a company I didn't even know existed. He died 3 months ago. The same month my marriage collapsed. The same month my life imploded. I sat there until my phone buzzed again. Another Uber request. I declined it. For the first time since the divorce, I didn't feel empty. I felt unsettled. Like the ground beneath my story had cracked open, revealing something unfinished underneath. I stared out at the city and realized something terrifying. If everything I believed about my father was wrong, what did that say about the man I'd been trying so hard to become? The app kept pulsing. But I didn't move. That night, nothing made sense anymore. And somehow, that was the first honest thing my life had offered me in a long time. By the time the sun came up, I still hadn't gone home. I drove aimlessly, the city fading from neon to gray, replaying the assistant's words over and over like a malfunctioning voicemail. James Holloway. Your father. 75% owner. Every mile I drove felt like I was outrunning something, memory, maybe, or the version of myself that had just cracked open. All my life, I'd believed there was a blueprint for men like me. Go to the right schools. Shake the right hands. Build something tangible, land, machines, companies. Keep emotions neat and contained. Love responsibly. Provide relentlessly. Don't look back. That was the man I was supposed to be. And for a long time, I wore that role well. I grew up watching my mother struggle without complaint. Bills paid late. Trucks breaking down. Nights where dinner was whatever could be stretched the farthest. She never spoke badly about my father, which somehow made his absence louder. When he disappeared, the story filled itself in. Men who leave are men who fail. So I decided early that I would never be that kind of man. I chased certainty the way some men chase love. I chose business because numbers didn't lie. Contracts didn't wake up unsure of themselves. Ownership felt like proof. By 26, I'd bought my first rig. By 30, I had a fleet. By 32, the ranch. People called it impressive. My ex-wife called it security. I called it enough. But enough is a dangerous word. It makes you stop asking better questions. Our marriage didn't explode. It eroded. Long hours turned into longer silences. Decisions became transactions. Love became logistics. We didn't fight, we optimized. When she wanted reassurance, I offered stability. When she wanted presence, I promised the future. I thought that was the same thing. The morning light hit my windshield as I pulled into a quiet overlook outside the city. I shut the engine off and finally let myself sit still. That's when the anger came. Not at her. At him. James Holloway. If he'd built something real, something substantial, why wasn't he there? Why let me believe he chose absence over effort? Why let me grow up thinking the worst of him? I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, the sound sharp and childish. You don't get to rewrite this now, I muttered. You don't get to be something after you're gone. My phone buzzed. A voicemail notification. A known number. I hesitated before pressing play. Mr. Holloway, a man's voice said, measured and professional. This is Thomas Reed. I was your father's attorney. We need to speak. There are matters he specifically instructed be shared with you, personally. Personally. That word sat heavy. I thought about deleting the message. About pretending this was just another coincidence. Another universe brushing past mine. Instead, I saved it. Because curiosity had finally beaten control. I spent the rest of the morning replaying moments I'd never questioned before. My father's rare phone calls. Always brief. Always focused on whether I was doing well. Not happy. Not fulfilled. Doing well. At the time, I'd taken it as distance. Now it felt like restraint. Like he was watching from somewhere I couldn't see. I remembered the first time I told him about the trucking company. There was a pause on the line. Be careful, he'd said. That was it. No praise. No warning. Just those 2 words. I'd hung up angry, convinced he didn't understand ambition. Now I wasn't so sure. By noon, exhaustion hit me like a delayed wave. I drove home, to the rental apartment I'd moved into after the divorce. White walls. Borrowed furniture. No history. I lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling, wondering how a man could build his entire identity around proving someone wrong, without ever knowing what they actually stood for. My ex-wife used to say I lived like I was being graded. "What happens when you finally get an A?" she asked once. I didn't have an answer then. I still didn't. In the afternoon, I returned Thomas Reed's call. He suggested we meet the following day. "There are documents," he said. "But more than that, context." Context. Another word I'd never valued until everything else fell apart. That evening, I opened an old box I hadn't touched since the move. Inside were things I'd carried forward without thinking: trophies, contracts, photographs. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper. A letter. My father's handwriting. I didn't remember when I'd received it, or why I'd never opened it. My hands trembled as I unfolded the page. So, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the timing right. I hope you know that was never because I didn't care. I stayed away because I was afraid of teaching you the wrong lesson. I stopped there. My throat tightened. The man I'd spent my life outrunning had been standing still, trying not to cast a shadow. For the first time, I considered something unsettling. What if the man I was supposed to be was never meant to be built in opposition at all? I folded the letter back up, heart pounding, knowing I wasn't ready to finish it yet. Outside, the city hummed back to life. And somewhere between the life I'd lost and the story I'd inherited, a new question began to form. If I stopped trying to be the man I was supposed to be, who would I become instead? Rock bottom isn't a single moment. It's a series of small humiliations you keep surviving. By the 3rd day after learning my father's name, Uber wasn't just something I did anymore. It was where I existed. 12-hour stretches. Coffee cups multiplying in the console. My sense of time blurring into pickup points and drop-offs. I stopped telling myself this was temporary. Temporary implies a plan. I didn't have one. The city revealed itself differently when you watch it through a windshield. People didn't look powerful anymore. They looked tired, hungover, nervous, relieved when they reached their destination, like surviving the day was an achievement worth celebrating. My first passenger that morning was a man about my age, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. "Airport?" he said, voice flat. We rode in silence for a while before he sighed. "Got laid off yesterday," he said, staring straight ahead. "Still wearing the suit because I don't know who I am without it." I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I get that." That was all. But something shifted. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't the only man in free fall. Later that afternoon, I picked up a couple arguing quietly in the back seat. Not shouting. Worse. Negotiating emotions like they were liabilities. "You promised you'd be there," she said. "I am here," he replied. "No," she said. "You're adjacent." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Somewhere between red lights, I realized I'd said those same words in different ways. Presence had never been my strength. By evening, exhaustion settled into my bones. Not the kind you fix with sleep. The kind that comes from pretending you're fine when you're not. I pulled over outside a grocery store and sat there longer than necessary, watching families load trunks. Kids laughing. Dogs panting. Small, ordinary moments that felt impossibly distant. My phone buzzed. Another message from Thomas Reed, my father's attorney. "Please confirm tomorrow's meeting. There are time-sensitive matters regarding the estate." His state. The words still felt fraudulent. I texted back a simple yes. Then the app chimed again. "Pickup request." I accepted. The passenger was an older woman with kind eyes and a posture that suggested she'd spent her life bracing herself. "Rough day?" she asked as she buckled in. I hesitated. "Rough year," I said. She smiled gently. "Aren't those the ones that change you?" I didn't answer. Halfway through the ride, she leaned forward. "You drive like someone who used to be in control," she said. "Not like someone who's lost it forever." The words landed harder than any insult could have. When I dropped her off, she tipped generously and said, "Be patient with yourself." I sat there for a moment after she left. Patient. That wasn't a word I'd ever associated with success. That night I drove until my eyes burned. Each passenger peeled away another layer of ego I hadn't known I was still wearing. A college kid chasing dreams with no backup plan. A father working 2 jobs, proud just to show up. A woman rebuilding after addiction, laughing louder than necessary. None of them knew who I'd been. And for the first time, that felt like relief. Around midnight, I declined a ride and pulled into a quiet park. The engine ticked as it cooled, filling the silence. I thought about the ranch, the land, the trucks, the illusion that scale equaled significance. I'd believed losing it all meant I was nobody. But sitting there, stripped of status and expectation, I felt something unfamiliar. My phone vibrated again. An email this time. From Thomas Reed. Attached was a single scan document. My father's signature at the bottom. Above it, a list of names. Small businesses. Community projects. Startups I'd never heard of. A handwritten note in the margin. Impact matters more than applause. My chest tightened. This wasn't an empire. It was quiet. Distributed. Intentional. Everything I'd dismissed as playing small. I thought about my ex-wife's text. "You'll never recover from this." Maybe she was right. Maybe I wouldn't recover the man I used to be. And maybe that wasn't the loss I thought it was. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. For the first time since everything collapsed, I wasn't planning my comeback. I was listening. The city breathed around me. Cars passed. Night insects hummed. Rock bottom hadn't arrived with a crash. It had pulled up quietly and asked me to get in. And somewhere between the strangers in my back seat and the ghost of a father I was just beginning to understand, I realized something dangerous. If I kept driving long enough, I might finally figure out who I was without an audience. I expected the meeting to feel official. Leather chairs. Polished wood. A man in a tailored suit sliding papers across a desk like they were answers. Instead, Thomas Reed's office felt lived in. Books stacked unevenly. Framed photographs that weren't about success, but people, families, ribbon cuttings, awkward smiles caught mid-laugh. It unsettled me, because nothing about my father had ever felt lived in. Thomas stood when I entered, extending a hand. "You look like him," he said before I could speak. I almost pulled my hand back. "That's not something people usually say to me," I replied. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I'd said. "James didn't want this to be easy," he said, gesturing for me to sit. He believed clarity should be earned. That sounded exactly like the kind of sentence a man like my father would leave behind. Thomas slid a thin folder across the desk. "Before we talk about numbers," he said, "you need context." I didn't touch the folder. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked. "About any of this?" Thomas exhaled. "Because he was afraid you'd chase the wrong version of him," he said. "The public one. Not the private one." The words scraped something raw. "He failed once," Thomas continued. "Spectacularly. Lost partners. Lost friends. Nearly lost himself. He rebuilt quietly after that. He believed anonymity was part of the lesson." I thought about my own collapse. How loud it had been. How public. Was I part of that lesson? I asked. Thomas hesitated. "Yes," he said. "But not in the way you think." He opened the folder, finally anchoring the conversation to something tangible. Inside weren't balance sheets or asset breakdowns. There were letters. Dozens of them. Some typed. Some handwritten. All addressed to different people. "These are the people he invested in," Thomas said. "Not companies. People." I picked one up. A mechanic who wanted to open his own shop. A single mother starting a logistics service. A former addict building a trucking cooperative. My throat tightened. "He didn't want credit," Thomas said. "He wanted outcomes." I laughed under my breath, a sharp sound. "That's not how business works," I said automatically. Thomas met my eyes. "It is," he said. "It's just not how ego works." The word landed like a verdict. He pulled out another document. A handwritten note. If my son ever finds this, it means he's lost something important. That loss is not a failure. It's an opening. My chest constricted. He updated his will 3 months ago, Thomas said gently, after your divorce filings became public. I looked up sharply. He knew. He watched, Thomas said. He always watched. The room felt suddenly smaller. All those years I thought I was invisible to him. And he'd been paying attention the entire time. Why didn't he reach out? I asked, my voice quieter now. Thomas folded his hands. Because he believed men learn more from consequences than instructions, he said. And because he was afraid you'd mistake rescue for love. I swallowed hard. That hit too close to home. He slid one final envelope toward me. This one was heavier. James asked me to give you this only if you came here on your own, Thomas said. No lawyers. No advisors. I stared at it. Inside is his remaining controlling interest, Thomas said. Not as inheritance. As responsibility. My heart pounded. There are conditions, he added. He was very clear about that. Of course he was. He believed wealth should be exercised, not possessed, Thomas said. You can't sell it. You can't leverage it. You can only use it to build what he couldn't finish. I leaned back, overwhelmed. This wasn't a bailout. It was a test. I stood slowly, folder clutched in my hands. All my life, I said, I thought he walked away because he didn't care. Thomas shook his head. He walked away because he cared too much, he said. About the wrong things becoming the lesson. Outside, the sun felt too bright. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. The irony settled in slowly. I'd lost everything chasing a version of success my father had already outgrown. And now he was asking me, not to recover it, but to choose what came next. I opened the envelope one last time, reading the final line in my father's handwriting. If you build this to be admired, you've missed the point. Build it so you can live with yourself. I closed my eyes. For the first time, the question wasn't how to win back what I'd lost. It was whether I was brave enough to let it stay gone. I didn't tell anyone about the envelope. Not my friends. Not my lawyer. Not even myself, at first. I drove home from Thomas Reed's office and placed it on the kitchen counter like it might detonate if I stared too long. For 3 days I let it sit there. I slept on the couch. I ate standing up. I drove Uber at night and came home just before sunrise, pretending exhaustion was the reason my hands shook. The truth was simpler. Money had always solved my problems. This time, it was asking questions. Every ride felt heavier now, like I was carrying a secret that changed the temperature of the world around me. When passengers complained about bosses or bonuses or missed promotions, I heard something new underneath it. Fear. Not of failure, but of being ordinary. That fear had shaped my marriage more than I'd ever admitted. I met my ex-wife when I was still building. Still hungry. She loved that version of me, the man with momentum, with plans, with certainty radiating off him like heat. But momentum is intoxicating. It makes you mistake speed for direction. We built a life that looked unbreakable from the outside. The ranch photos. The trucks lined up like trophies. The dinners with other couples comparing milestones instead of stories. Inside, we were slowly disappearing from each other. The night before I finally called her, I dreamed I was standing in the middle of the ranch, watching fences collapse one by one. Not violently. Quietly. Like they were relieved to fall. I woke up knowing what I had to do. I asked her to meet me somewhere neutral. A small cafe halfway between our new lives. No lawyers. No agendas. She arrived exactly on time. She looked different. Lighter. Not happier, just less braced. You look tired, she said. So do you, I replied. We sat in silence until the server brought coffee neither of us touched. I didn't come to talk about the settlement, I said finally. She raised an eyebrow. Then why did you come? I took a breath. Slower than I wanted to. Because I owe you the truth, I said. Not the version that defends me. The real one. Her posture shifted. Guarded but listening. I thought being a provider was the same as being present, I said. I thought if I built enough certainty, you wouldn't feel alone. She looked down at her hands. I didn't want certainty, she said quietly. I wanted to feel chosen. That landed harder than any accusation. I know, I said. I just didn't know it then. We talked for an hour. About missed dinners. About conversations cut short by phone calls. About how ambition had slowly crowded out tenderness. I don't think you're a bad man, she said at one point. I think you were afraid of stopping long enough to hear what you actually needed. She wasn't wrong. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't ask for another chance. Some things aren't meant to be recovered. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. For what it's worth, she said, I never wanted to take everything from you. I just didn't know how to stand next to you anymore. I nodded. Outside, the air felt cleaner. That afternoon, I finally opened the envelope again. I read my father's conditions slowly this time. No liquidation. No leverage. No exit strategy. Only reinvestment. Only stewardship. It wasn't a fortune. It was a responsibility map. I thought about the businesses he'd supported. The people he'd chosen. The quiet way he'd measured success. Then I thought about what I'd lost. Not the ranch. Not the money. But the version of myself that believed accumulation was the same thing as worth. That night, I declined every Uber request. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down one question. What would I build if no one ever applauded? The answer didn't come immediately. But something else did. Relief. Because for the first time since I was a boy, my future wasn't being graded. It was being chosen. I closed the notebook and looked around the quiet apartment. Inheritance isn't money. It's the permission to stop pretending. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I knew exactly what I was about to risk next. The offer came the way all temptations do. Quietly. Respectfully. Like it was doing me a favor. An old contact from finance reached out first. Then another. Men I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered my number, my reputation, my resume. They spoke in careful tones, as if my fall had made me fragile. We hear you're available, one of them said. Available. Like I'd been sitting on a shelf waiting to be useful again. They offered me a fast track back to the life I'd lost. A senior role. A clean title. A salary generous enough to erase the humiliation of the past few months. The unspoken promise was clear. Come back, and we'll pretend none of this happened. For a full night, I let myself imagine it. New suit. Corner office. My name restored to rooms where it still meant something. The quiet relief of knowing I'd never have to explain the Uber years to anyone who mattered. The old version of me leaned forward eagerly. This was recovery. This was winning. I stared at my notebook on the kitchen table. The single question still written there, staring back at me like it knew better. What would I build if no one ever applauded? The answer hadn't arrived fully formed. But the wrong answer had. I met with Thomas Reed again the following afternoon. Be honest with me, I said. If I take the finance job, what happens to my father's share? Thomas didn't hesitate. It remains yours, he said. But unused. Unused? As in wasted? I asked. As in dormant, he replied. James believed unused capacity was a kind of moral failure. I exhaled slowly. The choice crystallized in that moment. I could return to a world that applauded me, or step into one that required me. That evening, I drove past the old warehouse my father had purchased decades earlier. I'd never noticed it before. Brick exterior. Faded signage. Forgotten by a city obsessed with the next thing. I parked across the street and sat there for a long time. This was where he'd started again. Not loudly. Not impressively. But deliberately. My phone buzzed. Another message from the finance firm. We need your answer by tomorrow. I walked into the warehouse the next morning. Dust coated the floor. Light filtered through cracked windows. The space smelled like age and possibility. I could already see it. Not a monument. A workshop. A place where people rebuilt, not brands. I called the firm that afternoon. I'm out, I said. There was a pause. You sure? The voice asked. This is a rare opportunity. I know, I replied. That's why I'm saying no. When I hung up, My hands were shaking. Saying no felt heavier than any loss I'd endured. Because this time, there was no one to blame. I spent the next weeks draining what little savings I had left. Cleaning the warehouse myself. Meeting with the people my father had supported. Listening more than I spoke. Some said no. Some laughed. Some stayed. Every rejection felt personal. Every small win felt earned. One night as I locked up, doubt crept in. What if this was arrogance disguised as purpose? What if I'd mistaken loss for enlightenment? I sat on the warehouse steps, head in my hands. That's when my phone rang. An unknown number. "I heard you turned down the job," a familiar voice said. It was my former mentor. The man who'd once told me never to step off the ladder once I started climbing. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Men like us don't walk away from leverage." "Men like us?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Ambitious. Capable. Serious." I looked at the warehouse door. "I'm done being serious," I said. "I want to be useful." He didn't reply. The line went dead. I sat there until the sky darkened. The fear didn't disappear. But it changed shape. It stopped asking, "What if I fail?" and started asking, "What if this is who I was meant to become all along?" The choice had cost me everything familiar. But for the first time, it felt like something was finally being built on purpose. First thing I learned was that purpose doesn't protect you from failure. If anything, it makes the setbacks feel sharper. The warehouse didn't transform overnight. It stayed drafty, but unforgiving. Pipes leaked. Permits stalled. People showed up late or didn't show up at all. The city didn't care about intention. It cared about paperwork. So did the bank. I stood in a windowless office while a loan officer scanned my documents with polite skepticism. "No collateral," she said. "I'm not asking for charity," I replied. She smiled thinly. "Banks don't fund philosophies." I walked out feeling smaller than I had in months. At night I questioned everything. Had I mistaken guilt for wisdom? Had I romanticized struggle because it felt noble? The old voice, the one trained on spreadsheets and outcomes, kept resurfacing. "You're inefficient. You're exposed. You're wasting time." But each morning, people still came. A machinist with hands like sandpaper. A woman who'd lost her job and her confidence in the same week. A kid barely out of college who wanted to build something real instead of chasing buzzwords. They didn't come because I had answers. They came because I listened. That was new for me. I stopped introducing myself with titles. I stopped explaining my past. I asked better questions instead. What do you need? What's stopping you? What does success look like if no one ever posts about it? Some days, nothing moved. Other days, something small clicked into place. A prototype worked. A plan survived contact with reality. A man who hadn't believed in himself in years stood a little straighter. Those were the days that scared me. Because they made me care. Caring meant exposure. It meant staying present when things went wrong. It meant not hiding behind competence when emotions surfaced. One afternoon, a heated argument broke out between two founders over money they didn't have yet. The room tensed. I felt the old instinct rise, to control, to dominate, to impose order. Instead, I took a breath. "Say it again," I said. But slower. They did. The argument softened into something honest. That night, I caught my reflection in a dark window. I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked stronger, but because I looked present. The mirror didn't reflect a winner or a failure. Just a man standing where he said he would. A week later, the city inspector shut us down. "Temporary," he said. "Safety issue. Paperwork mismatch." Temporary still felt like a verdict. The room emptied quickly that evening. No one blamed me out loud. That somehow made it worse. I sat alone on a folding chair, staring at the closed door. Quitting would have made sense. Calling the finance firm back would have been easy. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over old contacts. Instead, I opened the note from my father again. "Build it so you can live with yourself." Living with myself, I realized, didn't mean always being certain. It meant staying. I stayed late. Fixed what I could. Made calls. Learned the language of permits and patience. The shutdown lifted 2 weeks later. When the doors reopened, the room filled faster than before. Word had spread, not about success, but about honesty. About a place where people weren't sold dreams. They were given space. The first Real win came quietly. One of the founders secured a modest contract. Not life-changing, but enough. Enough to pay himself. Enough to keep going. He shook my hand, eyes wet. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. The words hit me unexpectedly. I'd spent years trying not to give up on myself. I hadn't realized how much that required staying when others needed you. That night, I went home and stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection. Same face. Different posture. I thought about my father, how he'd rebuilt quietly, refusing to be seen as the man he used to be. I finally understood. This wasn't disappearance. It was integrity. I wasn't chasing redemption anymore. I was practicing it. The man in the mirror didn't look impressive. He looked accountable. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. But the real test hadn't arrived yet. It was waiting, in the form of one final conversation I'd been avoiding. One that would force me to face the only person whose opinion I'd never truly stopped fearing. Myself. The morning I returned the Uber car, it was raining. Not hard. Not dramatic. Just enough to soften the edges of the city, like the world was deliberately lowering its voice. I parked the car in the lot, turned the engine off, and sat there longer than necessary. The interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and long nights. Of conversations that never repeated themselves. Of a version of my life that had carried me when I couldn't carry myself. I rested my hand on the steering wheel. "Thank you," I said quietly. It wasn't gratitude for the car. It was gratitude for the man who'd survived inside it. I walked away without looking back. The warehouse was already awake when I arrived. Tools clinked. Voices overlapped. Someone laughed too loudly. The place still wasn't impressive. It never would be. But it was alive. I moved through the space without urgency, stopping to listen, to answer questions I didn't rush to solve. No one waited for me to lead dramatically. They just expected me to be there. And I was. Around midday, I found myself alone in the back office, the same folding chair, the same scarred desk. I opened my father's final letter again, this time reading it all the way through. "You will be tempted to prove something. Resist that urge. The men who matter most in your life don't need you to impress them. They need you to stay." I folded the letter carefully. For years, I'd believed masculinity was about endurance without vulnerability. About never needing help. About winning quietly and hurting alone. But standing there, listening to the warehouse breathe, I understood something my father had tried to teach without words. Strength isn't what you accumulate. It's what you refuse to abandon. In the afternoon, my ex-wife texted. Not about money. Not about the past. "I hope you're doing okay," she wrote. I stared at the message for a long time. Thought it back. "I am. Truly. I hope you are too." There was no ache in my chest when I sent it. Just clarity. As evening settled in, the warehouse emptied one person at a time. I locked up and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The pavement reflected the streetlights, steady and calm. I thought about the ranch. The trucks. The life I once believed defined me. I didn't miss it the way I thought I would. Because loss had stripped away the noise. And what remained was quieter, but stronger. I kept my name. Kept my word. I kept my ability to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. I kept the men and women who trusted me not because I was successful, but because I was present. And I kept the lesson my father left behind, buried not in money, but in restraint. That night, I stood in front of the mirror one last time. Same face. Same scars. But the man looking back at me wasn't asking to be admired anymore. He was asking one simple question. "Can you live with this life?" I nodded. Could. Some men measure recovery by what they get back. I measure it by what I no longer chase. I didn't recover my money. I didn't reclaim my old life. What I kept was something harder to steal. Myself. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough.